Thank you, Mariana. Thank you all for being in this room. I wish I were with you, and I was curious to know to visit your center, and it's a little frustrating that the trip couldn't happen. Let me start saying that I will be speaking mostly about literature today. For a long time now, I've been doing, especially with my teaching, but also some writing to exploring slavery in literary texts and in legal texts, especially in legal suits, in parallel manner, trying to see how these different types of texts actually illuminate each other if you read them together, seeking the relations between them. So I approach literature from the perspective of a social historian, and to offer a very brief definition of the way I understand social history to mean, is that I seek to interpret what people do with what is done to them. It is Sartrean existentialist formulation. So I'm worried about slave agency. I'm still worried about it, and it's still very important to understand how people in a dependent condition or people under bondage, how they deal with the structures of power and the violence they are subject to. So this is, at this point, I'm working on a book project which is about gender and slavery, in the sense that I have noticed over the years that in several novels and in legal suits that I read parallel to each other, there were situations in which literary authors represented moments in which slaves and women, seigneurial women, somehow allied or at least perceived they shared interest in confronting the patriarchal power that submitted them. And their strategies and ways of dealing with this patriarchal power that, in order to avoid humiliation and violence, the strategies in which in these literary works, the slaves and women, what they did to deal with this, I found more and more that they were related. They were strategies that could be compared and understood better if they were seen together and in relation to each other. And then in several freedom suits, especially situations in which a couple, a seigneurial couple, slave-holding couple, is in a situation of conflict. There are several cases in which, for example, the wife decides to grant freedom to a number of slaves, or leaves the house, taking with her domestic slaves to whom she promises freedom or decides to write mission letters to. And these conflicts around slaves showed again these possibilities of slaves and women being together in their perception of being under the yoke, the control of the slave, of patriarchal authorities. Also, especially in the work of Machado de Assis, which is the author I'm going to speak mostly, but basically the subject today, in his case, it really works thinking in the way that Toni Morrison, in her book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, she says that, arguing against the idea that the canon works of 19th century US literature did not speak about race. She argues, I think, very convincingly that sometimes passages that, you cannot relate the importance of race in these 19th century works to the space race occupies on the surface of literary works. And she shows that many times scenes and passages and characters that seem to be secondary on the surface of a plot are actually decisive to understand the major forces that are shaping a certain narrative. And in the case of Machado, there is a further complication because most of the time he is inventing narrators, very often who have an autobiographical type of impulse. And this fictional autobiographers, they are the ones that have this moment of truth in relation to race. And so there's a further layer here that must be interpreted. So I sent you, I'm going to read, because I don't know if everybody had a chance to read, just an introduction, because I'm going to be speaking about Machado de Assis, and although I say that Machado de Assis is our Shakespeare in Brazil, all Brazilians read Machado de Assis, at least from their teenage years, and you have to do it. It's an author in the periphery of the literary canon. And so I think I thought I should give you some idea about why he's so important and so important for my purposes in this long-term project. In the project, I'm going to work with his literature and then with other authors that wrote about slavery and race in Brazil, other literary works. I'm also planning to use some comparison with works of literature in the US, perhaps in other places, but that's still in very initial stages. And then also I have a bunch of freedom suits or enslavement suits, attempts to re-enslave or enslave people who had been freed or to revoke their freedoms. And these are the types of documents that I will be reading side by side. So Machado de Assis is widely regarded as the most important Brazilian novelist of all times. He was a founding member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, and he was born in 1839 in Rio. He was the son of a house painter whose parents had been born slaves but achieved freedom, and a poor Portuguese woman. The couple also had a daughter who died during a measles epidemic in 1845 when he was 4 years old. The family lived as dependents on the property of the widow of Barroso Pereira, a powerful man who had been a senator and cabinet minister of the empire. The Assis couple seemed to have enjoyed some favor with the seigneurial family. The wealthy widow herself and her son-in-law served as godparents at Machado de Assis' baptism. Interestingly, in the same ceremony, his parents appeared as godparents at the baptism of a slave girl born to an African woman belonging to a member of the Barroso clan. Growing up in a prosperous household located on a hill adjacent to downtown Rio, Machado learned firsthand the hierarchical customs and practices that produced chains of dependent relations involving everyone on the property. The humblest, African slaves, Crioulo slaves, those born in Brazil, Freed people, as were his grandparents, people of African descent born free, as was his father, and poor Portuguese immigrants, as was his mother, and so on. Information regarding Machado's childhood's discourse, especially mysterious, is how he acquired an early mastery of both his native language and of French, a language in which he seemed fluent and wrote poems before he turned 20 years of age. His parents were both able to read and write, a rarity for people of their condition, however favored by their seigneurial protectors. Biographers have suggested that his Portuguese mother may have taught him to read and write. Following his mother's death from tuberculosis, his father married again to a free woman of African descent. The family moved to a distant neighborhood of the city where Machado's stepmother became a confectioner at a nearby boarding school for girls. According to oral testimony given to biographers by former students of the institution, Machado used to go to school with her stepmother, auditing some classes and having access to books. He would have learned French in this period, either from auditing lessons at the school or from a local baker, or both. He would improve his skills interacting with the community of French political émigrés who established a newspaper in Rio in the late 1850s. Towards the end of the decade, Machado had become a regular contributor to several periodicals, publishing poems, reviewing literary works, and translating pieces from French. In 1860, he joined a liberal daily newspaper that was critical of the concentration of power in the hands of the emperor, defended the expansion of citizenship rights, and often seemed to hold Republican ideals. He wrote extensively about theater and opera, reviewed and promoted new novels and poetic works, thus becoming quite an influential figure in Rio's world of arts and letters. Allegedly weary of the uncertainties and responsibility of running the paper virtually by himself, he sought and obtained a job in the public sector in 1868, becoming assistant to the director of the government periodical that published legislative acts and other official business. He would remain a proud and modest civil servant to the end of his life. In 1869, he married Carolina Novaes, a Portuguese woman, sister of a recently deceased friend of his, a satirical poet. The couple had no children and remained together until Carolina's death in 1904. Regarding Machado's experience as a civil servant, the most important period, and one that may have influenced his literary works in decisive ways, began in 1873 when he moved to the Ministry of Agriculture. There, in 1876, he would become head of the department in charge of following the application of the gradual slave emancipation law of 1871. This piece of legislation, known as the Free Womb Law, declared free all children born to slave mothers after 28 September 1871. The law also provided for the protection of slave savings, recognized slaves' right to freedom by self-purchase irrespective of master's consent, established a compulsory slave registration system, and created an emancipation fund to increase the number of manumissions. In sum, it gave enslaved people several rights and sought to submit the private power of masters to the rule of law. Machado led a team of bureaucrats in charge of resolving doubts concerning the dispositions of the 1871 law, seeking to overcome slave owners' strategies for evading application of the legislation. He devoted himself to the task efficiently and passionately, upheld by the resistance put forward by proprietors. In his novels and short stories, major events in the characters' lives often happen during or around the time of political and social turmoil associated with the enacting and application of the 1871 law. It is frequently the case in Machado's stories that petty domestic dramas of marriage and adultery serve as metaphors for major historical events taking place in Brazil and in the West. Literary critics tend to divide Machado's career as a novelist in two rather different phases. The first 4 novels are deemed conventionally romantic, however sharp they may be at times in their dissection of the inner workings of seigneurial power and its paternalist ideology. On the other hand, it is true that omniscient third-person narrators of these novels seem to hold traditional views of religion and marriage, firmly appreciative of family traditions. This is a quote, expressions from one of his novels, family traditions, assets, and acquired relations, the founding principles of the best classes of society, as is stated in one of his novels. On the other hand, there are moments in which the reader is actively invited, as would be usual procedure in the later novels, to engage in the ironic demolition of the ideological tenets of a decadent slaveholding class. In any case, it remains true that there is little in these earlier novels to prepare readers for what was to come in the next 5, beginning with the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, which appeared in serialized form in a literary magazine in 1880, and then as a book in 1881. Machado wrote a novel immediately after having been involved in an acrimonious debate about literary movements, especially regarding realism in its extreme form, naturalism. Machado combined skepticism in relation to naturalism with a similar attitude concerning social Darwinism and other deterministic renderings of society and history fashionable at the time. The scathing critique of Western scientific ideologies and their hasty appropriation by local elites appeared right at the outset in the dedication of the book, which read as follows: "To the worm who first gnawed the cold flesh of my corpse, I dedicate this posthumous memoirs as a nostalgic remembrance." The reader learns right afterwards that the memoir he or she is about to read is posthumous, not in the usual sense that it became known after the death of its author, but because the author wrote it after his death from the other world. Writing in a style that somewhat imitated 18th century English and French writers, Sterne and Diderot, for example, and mocking romantic and realist novelists of the 19th century, Brás Cubas related his life with the alleged independence possible only to an author who had no further interests in things pertaining to this world. During his life, Brás had been a wealthy man, owner of real estate and slaves, surrounded by dependents, a lawyer full of apparent erudition and rationality, who acquired political influence and became a member of the Brazilian parliament. His position as an author, who came into being after death, supposedly allowed him to relate events candidly. Thus, he boastfully presented his adulterous affair with a married woman as the main event of his life. Nonetheless, as was the case in some passages in previous novels, especially regarding women, the narrator missed many of the careful moves and strategies deployed by people who imagined himself controlling. These situations originated many occasions from humor, which Machado used to explore the narrowness of the narrator's views concerning class and gender relations. Furthermore, these passages appear to rely also on the social prejudices and misogyny of readers to achieve their ironic effects. So, just to make sure that everybody knows about whom I'm speaking of, and his importance, or why he's so fascinating for someone interested in the history of slavery in the 19th century. So his next novel was Quincas Borba, and this is the novel I'm turning to from now on. So I just wrote down in this handout the proper names in Portuguese, because I know proper names in a foreign language are sometimes hard to follow. And then some passages that I'm going to quote are also in the handout to make it easier for you to follow my reasoning. At least if you are like me, my eyes are more intelligent than my ears. And so seeing the passages might help. Quincas Borba, the title of the novel, is the story of Julio, a teacher from the interior of the province of Minas Gerais, who suddenly becomes the sole heir to an enormous fortune. His benefactor was Quincas Borba himself an unexpected heir, the inventor of a philosophy, and the very same castaway from existence and beggar who had appeared in the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, Machado's previous novel and the first, perhaps the only, book by its supposed author and narrator, Brás Cubas. The story is told by a third-person omniscient narrator who delves freely into the minds of the novel's characters. The transparency of fictional minds is taken for granted. Although different strategies are deployed to convey to the readers their inner workings. More often, the narrator tells us what is going on in the fictional minds, although sometimes there is a smooth transition to an inner dialogue, to an inner monologue, duly indicated with quotation marks. In either case, the realist effect of the text depends mostly not on descriptions of external scenes and objects, or even of specific episodes, but paradoxically on the representation of lone fictional figures, thinking thoughts that he or she will never communicate to his or her fellow imagined characters. Furthermore, the narrator is an intruder, sometimes taking unexpected turns and even mocking the readers for not having been able to anticipate certain partial outcomes in the story. Thus, although formally and predominantly a third-person narrator, the supposed author of the book allows for much subjectivity and skillful manipulations to become apparent to the readers. That is, as says the narrator himself, speaking directly to the imagined readers, quote, "You would have seen the manipulations had you read slowly," unquote. The narrator seeks to frame his interactions with the readers in a way that is apparent right at the outset of the novel, in its first paragraph. It's the first paragraph that you have in the handout. Julio was staring at the cove. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Anyone could see him with his thumbs stuck in the belt of his dressing gown at the window of a mansion in Botafogo would have thought he was admiring that stretch of calm water. But in reality, I can tell you, he was thinking about something else. He was comparing the past to the present. What was he a year ago? A teacher. What is he now? A capitalist. He looks at himself, at his slippers from Tunis that his new friend Cristiano Pada had given him, at the house, at the garden, at the cove, at the hills, and at the sky, and everything, from slippers to sky, everything gives off the same feeling of property, quote. The narrator postulates a general, undifferentiated observer, anyone, supposedly a reader or readers of the novel, who would necessarily interpret incorrectly the meaning of the first sentence of the text. They imagine readers who would think that Julio was indeed staring at the beautiful landscape in front of him, an even more reasonable hypothesis given the well-known fact that the view of the cove in Botafogo with the sugar loaf in plain sight was, and still is, indeed stunning, often depicted in 19th-century paintings and photographs. However, the narrator assures the readers that what is going on is altogether different, only visible to him who has access to Julio's mind and therefore can know what he was thinking about. The relation between the narrator and his readers is then set up in historically asymmetrical terms, with the former asserting his superior knowledge in relation to the latter as a routine, structural characteristic of the narration. On the one hand, this feature of the text allows for the omniscient narrator to play games with the readers, offer them false leads, tease and scold them for their supposed lackluster skills as interpreters of the text. On the other hand, the narrator's subjectivity, including his worldviews and ideology as a patriarchal figure pertaining to a slave-holding class, becomes more readily scrutable from the perspective of a social historian of literary works. The opening paragraph of the novel mentions one name, the paragraph we just saw, Rubião's new friend, Cristiano Palha. After explaining the circumstances that made Rubião, Quincas Borba's sole heir, the narrator relates how the former teacher made acquaintance with Palha and his wife, Sofia. Rubião was traveling from Minas Gerais to Rio to take care of the inventory pertaining to Quincas Borba's will, when at the station in Vassouras, a major coffee county in the province of Rio, the couple, Palha and Sofia, got on the train and took seats opposite to him. The two men started a conversation that would lead them to exchange favors, become friends, engage together in financial deals and businesses. Furthermore, Rubião became a frequent presence at tea parties, dinners, and other social occasions in which the couple entertained guests in their house. Although hesitant to start the friendship with the couple because of Sofia, since he didn't know how to behave with ladies, his words, Rubião's words, it does not take more than one first gathering in the couple's house for Rubião to be dazzled by Sofia's beauty and charm. Quote, he went to dinner, a blast decision. Where would he have found hours like those? Sofia was much better at home than on the train. There, she'd been wearing a cape, even though she had her eyes uncovered. Here she had her eyes and her body in plain view, elegantly clad in a cambric dress, showing her hands, which were pretty, and the beginning of an arm. In addition, here she was the lady of the house. She spoke more, outdid herself in kindnesses. Rubião went back down half in a daze. The passage begins to introduce two pieces of information which, further unveiled in the novel's following chapters, are decisive both to the narrator's construction of Rubião's falling maddeningly in love with Sofia and to his inducing the reader to mistakenly believe that Sofia reciprocated such sentiment, at least to some extent. First, Sofia enjoyed being seen. Thus, she added calculated elegance and demeanor to her natural beauty to collect the admiring gaze of other people. Apparently, women were mostly envious, and men dreamed of erotic trysts and adultery. The narrator explains, nonetheless, that displaying Sofia was originally her husband's idea. As a touch of vanity, Palha went to theaters and other gatherings that did not amuse him much because he liked, quote, to show off his wife's eyes, her eyes and her breasts, unquote. He would have, quote, his life wear low-cut gowns whenever he could and even where he shouldn't, unquote. The narrator compares him to Candulis, the king of Lydia, who, according to legend, was so proud of his wife's beauty that forced his favorite bodyguard to secretly see her nude to prove his point. At first, Sofia had resisted the idea of showing off, but, quote, ended up enjoying being seen, unquote. The second important piece of information is that, albeit polite with all her guests, Sofia had been asked by her husband to treat Rubião, quote, with special consideration, unquote. These two pieces of information are not offered to the readers right at the beginning of Rubião's attraction for Sofia, neither are they offered as explanations for the man's falling for her. The narrative concentrates mostly on Rubião's thoughts about Sofia, his dreams of having her, and the inner conflicts he has about his sentiments given his friendship with Palha. Until chapter 51, the narrator, for whom all minds are transparent, does not venture into Sofia's thoughts. She is reduced to silence, while dutifully fulfilling her husband's wishes for her to show off and to please a special and frequent guest with whom he started to cut very lucrative financial deals. Julio interprets the special consideration he received from Sophia in his own way. In his thoughts, he would enumerate circumstances which seemed to hint that the beautiful lady had been inviting him, quote, to fly off to those clandestine lands, unquote. Frequent looks, even stares, manners, compliments, giving him the honor of sitting next to her at the dinner table, quote, telling him pleasant things in a melodious voice, unquote, and so on. The former teacher, now a capitalist, perhaps imagining that he could include women among the everything that then inspired in him the same feeling of property, becomes determined. Finding the occasion when he's alone in the garden with Sophia, he moves forward. Quote, the third quote that you have in your handout. Julio remembered a note comparison, a very old one he'd picked up from some 10-line stanza back in 1850 or thereabouts, or from some page of prose from all ages. He called Sophia's eyes the stars of the earth and the stars the eyes of heaven. All of that in a low, tremulous voice. Sophia was astonished. She suddenly straightened up her body, which had been weighing on Julio's arm until then. She was so accustomed to the man's bashfulness. Stars? Eyes? She wanted to tell him to stop teasing her, but she didn't know how to put a response together. Unquote. As I mentioned before, and we'll develop later, but not in the pages you're listening to now. Until this point, the narrator had focused his attention mainly on the inner workings of Julio's mind. Only his perspective on his interactions with Sophia had been made available to readers. Therefore, it is possible that at least some readers expected his declaration of love to Sophia to happen at any moment. It is also possible that Sophia's astonishment regarding Julio's advance seemed somewhat surprising to the same readers. This is the first time that the narrator describes what is going on in Sophia's mind. Furthermore, the situation is depicted in such a way that whoever thought that Julio had had the slightest chance to coax Sophia into an adulterous relationship realized that he or she had missed something, had not been reading as slowly as he or she should, as the narrator would later observe. After all, the whole scene is ridiculous, a heavy mockery of romantic cliches, to say the least. Upon learning of the episode, Padre himself remarked to Sophia that you can see that it's the request of a poor innocent soul. That's the way 15-year-old girls talk. That's the way boobs talk all the time. Poets too, unquote. Chapter 50 recounts the conversation between Sophia and her husband after the party in which Julio declared his love for Sophia. It starts with the narrator addressing an imaginary woman reader. Quote, "No, my dear lady, that ever so long day isn't over yet," unquote. A procedure not unusual to Machado's fictional authors. However, the tone of the intervention, the fact that it goes on for a paragraph and spills to the first sentence of the following one, quote, "be patient," unquote, seems to suggest to women readers to be on the alert for something. The narrator says to his dear lady that, quote, "it's even possible that you will find a better taste here than in the case of the hanged man," unquote. The episode of the hanged man, related in chapter 47, describes Julio's thoughts as he returned home from the party hosted by Sophia and Padre. Confused after his declaration to Sophia, torn between a certain pride for his macho daring and feeling guilty for having betrayed the confidence of Palha, her husband and his friend, Rubion's mind escapes from reality and delves into memory, remembering his witnessing of an execution many years before. Rubion seems to relive the experience, his emotions and shock at the scene, perhaps made more unsettling for reasons that I will explore later, basically the relation between his feeling guilt about having declared to Sophia and feeling guilt about slavery as a metaphor. This situation is a metaphor for that. Because both the executioner and the condemned were black men, probably enslaved men. Thus, the comparison between Rubion's memories of a hanging described a couple of chapters before and the promise to relate, quote, what happened between Sophia and Palha after everyone had left appears perhaps disproportionate at first. The conversation starts well, with Palha making witty and somewhat malicious comments about their guests, the couple laughing together, happy with the nice party they had given. Then, quote, stroking her husband's hair, unquote, Sophia challenges him to guess, quote, what the best episode of the evening was, unquote. Since Palha does not have a clue, and after warning him that she did not want any huffing, quote, or any row, Sophia tells him of Rubion's declaration. Palha reacts with surprise. Rubion? And Sophia proceeds to tell of her own amazement. She, quote, couldn't have imagined such a thing. They always seemed so bashful and respectful to me, unquote. As she offers more details, arguing that they should sever relations with Rubion, quote, we've got to shut the door on him, unquote. Palha responds either with monosyllables or silence. When the narrator turns to his mind, we see that he is seeking a way to downplay the event and placate the woman's indignation. He thinks that it is natural that her wife's charms would captivate a man. Does not seem to bother much about Rubion's looking at her a lot, or even with the fact that Sophia, quote, on some occasions, would repay those looks with others of her own, unquote. These are, quote, concessions of a pretty woman, unquote, and he would not, quote, be jealous of the optic nerve, unquote. After pondering the situation a little longer and addressing his wife at last, he says that she, quote, got more upset than the case deserves, unquote. And then, in a sudden shifting tone, although trying to be playful, he turns it all against Sophia. There is not much in comparing, quote, a young woman's eyes to the stars, unquote. It could be done, quote, in front of the general public, unquote. Quote, the blame belongs to those pretty eyes of yours, unquote. A few lines below, Palha articulates a full indictment of his wife for the episode. This is quote 4. But after all, Sophia, whatever gave you the idea of inviting him to go have a look at the moon? Please tell me. I called Dona Tonica to come with us. But once Dona Tonica refused, you should have found ways and means not to go into the garden. They are things that can immediately incite a person. You're the one who gave him the opportunity. Sophia looked at him, contracting her thick eyebrows. She was going to answer, but she remained silent. Palha continued to develop the same theme. The blame was hers. She shouldn't have given him the opportunity. But didn't you tell me yourself that we should treat him with special consideration? I certainly wouldn't have gone into the garden if I could have imagined what was going to happen. But I never expected that a man who was so quiet, so I don't know what, would throw care to the winds and say strange things to me. Well, from here on, avoid the moon and the garden, her husband said, trying to smile. But Cristiano, How do you want me to talk to him the next time he comes here? I'm not up to such a thing. Look, the best thing would be to break off relations, unquote. Sophia's predicament in regard to male power and entitlement is now complete. She finds herself between the predator, an apparent little dove who turned out to be a hawk in her own rendering, making passes at the wife of a friend, and the husband, whose alleged righteousness makes him blame her for the episode. There follows a silence, during which the narrator visits Pallas, the husband's, thoughts again. He remains in the same rationale, seeking to find a way to avoid Sophia's demand that they break off relations with Rubião immediately. Unable to come up with a new idea, Pallas retreads the argument that Sophia is overreacting, that Rubião is, quote, wet behind the ears, that he became daring because he had drunk a little wine, that as her husband, he would never allow anyone to show you a lack of respect, that he is made of steel in that respect. This is a quote. However, Sophia continues determined, conceding only after another bout of discussion that relations could be terminated, quote, little by little if you want, unquote. Seeing that his wife would not change her mind, Pallas seems finally sincere about what is at stake in the case. Quote, but, my love, I owe him a lot of money, unquote. Sophia gives him at last, promises to try to be colder with Rubião, and asks Pallas to behave as if he did not know anything about what had happened. The last scene of the chapter is a classic of 19th-century marriage scenes, and perhaps of marriage scenes much beyond the 19th century. Pallas says to Sophia, quote, let's go, it's late, kissing her on the cheek. Sophia replies that she has, quote, enough of headache, unquote. So the next day, Sophia sits alone in the garden and reflects upon the whole episode of the previous night. She regrets having told her husband of what had happened, seeming especially upset by, quote, the attempts at an explanation that he gave her, unquote. She finds Pallas' insistence that they continue to receive Rubião unseemly. However, she appears to be unwilling to continue to confront him about the subject. She does not wish, quote, to obey or disobey, unquote, fears that she may eventually become the object of public suspicion or calumny, thinks of leaving town to some distant place. The narrator continues to render Sophia's thoughts as follows, quote, it was my fault, she sighed to herself. The fault lay in the special attention she paid to the man, concerns, mementos, special favors, and the night before, those eyes fixed on him for so long. If it hadn't been for that was how she was getting lost in multiple reflections. Everything was bothering her. Plants, furniture, a cicada that was singing, the sound of voices in the street, another of dishes in the house, the coming and going of the slave girls, and even a poor old black man across from her house who was having trouble climbing a section of the hill. The black man's difficulties were getting on her nerves. Perhaps I can draw inspiration for Quincas Barbera's narrator and ask the reader with what intonation he or she read the first line of the passage above. Quote, it was my fault, unquote. One possibility would be reading it with a tone of resignation, seemingly in agreement with the husband's contention that his wife was to blame for Rubião's advances. So it was my fault, in a resigned tone. This interpretation appears plausible, considering the lines that immediately follow. in which Sophia recapitulates her attitudes regarding Rubião, finding reasons for regret. Quote, if it hadn't been for that. Nevertheless, in the next line, quote, she was getting lost in multiple reflections, unquote. The narrator proceeds to describe Sophia's mindset as one of irritation, even rage. Familiar objects, customary noises, the usual movement of slaves going about their domestic chores, everything bothers her. Then she focuses on the poor old black man, quote, struggling to climb the hill, and the scene leads her to the apex of her fit of rage. Therefore, judging from the last lines of the passage, it would be possible to read the line, "It was my fault," clenching one's teeth in silent anger. It was my fault. It was my fault. I don't know. Well, you need an author to represent this, to read this line with different intonations. But I think it's decisive to think which intonations would be possible. In this case, instead of showing resignation concerning Palha's attitude of blaming her for Rubião's behavior, Sophia is angry at her husband and seeks to control herself, concealing her state of mind from husband and servants alike. Then, the first lines of the passage must be read again, imagining that perhaps Sophia thought them with an ironic disposition, perhaps not grasped by the narrator, that precedes and prepares for the inner outburst of anger. An intriguing aspect of the passage is that the narrator offers no reason for the fact that Sophia's anger reaches its highest point when she observes, quote, the black man's difficulties, unquote, to climb up the hill. There is no apparent logic in her emotions, no obvious explanation of why the travails of a poor old black man would get on her nerves more intensely than the coming and going of domestic slaves, street noises, blends, and so on. The narrator's silence on the subject contrasts, for example, with his attitude at the opening paragraph of the book, as we have seen. There, he explains to the reader that there is a contrast between what Rubião sees and what he thinks at that moment. That is, seeing the cove, he thinks about something else. Here, in the concluding paragraph of chapter 51, it is possible to surmise that a similar dynamic takes place. Seeing the black man, Sophia thinks of something else. What is Sophia thinking about? In the case of Rubião, which may perhaps give us a clue, he reflects about his new condition, on the change from teacher to capitalist and the feeling of empowerment that comes with it. I would argue that in seeing the black man, Sophia is thinking about her condition as a married woman and the subordination to patriarchy that seems inherent to it. Furthermore, observing the plight of the black man, toiling endlessly to reach apparently nowhere, he is described as just climbing a hill. Sophia becomes aware that there may be underlying similarities between her condition as a woman and the condition of enslaved people in 19th century Brazilian society. Both the black man and she are submitted to the inviolable will of male patriarchal figures. The unwanted comparison irritates her and, as we'll see next, teaches her, because this is the continuation of the text, teaches her lessons about how to deal with her subordination. That is, it gives her ideas about what to do with what the structures of patriarchy do to her. The narrator's silence regarding what thoughts Sophia is thinking at that moment, I argue, reveals the limits of the narrator's, understanding about alterity and corresponding mechanisms of resistance pertaining to that society. In other words, silence in Sophia in this particular instance, and in contrast with the fictional author's previous attitude of silencing her through rendering her only through Rubion's eyes until the episode of the Declaration of Love is not an intentional act. It is rather a result of the narrator's perspective as an observer that exists within historically specific configurations of class relations, gender ideologies, and labor regimes. That is, the demise of slavery and the emergence of other racialized forms of precarious freedom and or unfree labor. Thus, more generally, this is a project about the intertwining of gender and slavery in the literature of Machado de Assis and in other literary figures of the period. More specifically, it is an attempt to make plausible the interpretation presented above of what Sophia is thinking in the passage of the poor old black man climbing the hill. Imagining Sophia's thoughts on this occasion involved an extensive effort of reading slowly different passages and texts, literary or not, of looking at their parallel existences and possible connections, and of articulating a discourse of proof that demonstrates the plausibility of the suggested meaning given to the passage. I read Machado de Assis because his literary works allow for a full exposure of the entrails of a society soaked in patriarchal privilege, sexism, and racism. Slavery and its legacies structure the inequalities that then prevail and still shape, in large part, a society that is notoriously violent and resistant to change. Machado's self-contained disgust and rage, combined with stunning narrative virtuosity, are the best guides to horrors so normalized that observers may indeed believe, seeing Brazil from a distance, that its best representation may be a landscape painting of, say, the Cove in Botafogo. Since Machado's preferred method of exposition is to not say what's really moving characters and events, challenging readers to scrape the surface of and look deeper into texts produced by narrators filled with a sense of entitlement and proud of their storytelling prowess, quote, therefore unable to understand their own deeper motivations, my major interpretive challenge is to show that there were social experiences available to permit reading these texts beyond the stories that they purposefully tell and the meanings that they ostensibly propagate. Although this text is yet another exercise of reading against the grain to achieve a certain understanding of literary texts, its ultimate objective is to render the suggested literary interpretations historically plausible. It's not enough to validate a certain reading of a text to conceive of the logical possibility of interpreting it in a given way. Granted that the articulation of a certain interpretation of a text validates the possibility of reading it in a certain way when uttering the interpretation, the challenge of showing that such an interpretation was plausible at the time that the text was conceived is what interests me here. Machado's narrators are not aware of many dissenting discourses that are available to the characters that they bring into existence. The space between mentioning an old black man climbing a hill and not being able to describe what goes on in the mind of the lady seeing the scene is enormous. Such space is a narrative void that can only be filled with the contents of social history, that is, with the observation of how class, gender, and race factor into or shape the manner of making whatever is articulated in that society. My method of exposition means simply to analyze approximately coeval parallel passages from the same literary works, from different literary works of the same author, from literary works of different authors, from literary works and other types of texts, such as trial records, this enunciation was a summary of the contents that follow in the project, or whatever else seems relevant to demonstrate the argument for the plausibility of a hypothetical interpretation. By parallel passages, I understand passages that can be demonstrated to address the same questions, explicitly or not. Often, the best interpretive opportunities emerge when there is a way of comparing transparent and elusive passages on a given topic. The former allowing us to see what remains virtually unspoken about in the latter, however essential to its making. That's it.